Picture a woman alone in a great dark house an hour before dawn, sitting on the cold floor of a music room with a violin across her knees, a violin worth more than the horses in her husband's stable. And picture her hands, which have never in their life broken anything on purpose, closing slowly around its slender neck. She is not weeping. That is the first thing you would notice if you could stand in the doorway and watch her, that her face is dry and terribly calm, calmer than it has been in years. Because a woman who has finally decided is calmer than a woman who is still hoping. The candle beside her has almost guttered out. In a few hours the house will wake, and her husband will come looking for the instrument he gave away last night as though it were his to give, and he will not find it whole. He will find it snapped clean through the neck, ruined past any playing. And he will never understand, not that morning and not for years after, why a woman would break the most precious thing she owned rather than let another woman hold it. But you will understand by the end of this story, and so will everyone who ever wronged her. If you have ever had someone take a thing that was sacred to you and hand it carelessly to the very person who hurt you most, as though your grief were a party favour, then you already know the cold that is filling that music room in the hour before dawn. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, and if you believe there are some things a person should break with their own hands rather than surrender, say so plainly. Because this is the story of a Duchess who did exactly that, and of the ruin it began for the man who thought her too meek to do anything at all. Subscribe and stay with me to the very end, because the sound of that violin snapping in the dark was not the sound of a woman breaking. It was the sound of a woman beginning. To understand how it came to that music room and to that hour, we have to go back to a marriage that was quiet on the surface and hollow all the way down, and to a mother's gift that was the only warm thing left inside it. Beatrice was the daughter of a woman the whole country had once come to hear. Her mother had been a violinist of rare and unfashionable genius, a woman who had played before princes and been loved by ordinary people in market squares, and who had died when Beatrice was 14, leaving her one daughter two things of any value: the memory of a warmth that had lit a whole modest household, and the violin itself, a deep-voiced old instrument with a grain like dark honey that had been in the mother's hands every day of her working life. Beatrice had learned to play on that violin at her mother's knee, and after her mother died she played it still, alone, in the evenings, and it was the one place in the world where she was neither her father's obedient daughter nor, later, her husband's ornamental wife, but simply herself and her mother's daughter, and briefly, achingly happy. When Beatrice married Gerard, Duke of Ashcombe, at the age of 20, she brought very little to the great cold house at Ashcombe that Gerard valued, because Gerard had married her for the comfortable fortune her merchant grandfather had left in trust, and cared nothing for the girl who came attached to it. But she brought the violin, and in the early days, when she was still foolish enough to hope, she had once played for him, in the long drawing-room, the piece her mother had loved best, pouring into it everything she did not yet know how to say aloud. Gerard had listened for perhaps 2 minutes, and then he had yawned, and asked whether she meant to be much longer, because he had promised to look in at his club. She never played for him again. But she kept playing for herself, and the violin remained, through everything that came after, the one thing at Ashcombe that was truly and only hers. It is worth understanding what that instrument was, because everything in this story turns on it. It was not merely valuable, though it was that collectors had written to Beatrice's mother across the years offering sums that would have bought a small estate, and been refused each time. Because to her mother the violin was not property, but a partner. The other half of a conversation she had carried on with the world her whole life. It had a voice unlike any other, deep and slightly dark, the makers said, from 200 years of being played daily by hands that loved it. For an instrument, like a person, becomes over time the sum of how it has been treated. Beatrice remembered her mother saying that a violin left in a case grows sullen and thin, and a violin played with love grows warm and true, and that the same, she suspected, was so of women, and that Beatrice should remember it when she was grown. She had not understood at 14 what her mother meant. She understood it now, married into a cold house to a man who kept her in a case, and wondered why she had grown thin and silent. The violin was the one part of herself she had refused to let go sullen. She played it in secret the way another woman might have prayed, and it kept something alive in her that Ashcombe, for all its careful cruelty, had never managed to kill. The house was cold in the way these old great houses are cold, not merely in the stone but in the marriage that rattled around inside it. Gerard was handsome and idle and vain, a man who had never been refused and so had never developed the muscles a soul needs to bear refusal. He was courteous to Beatrice at the dinner table and absent from her life in every way that mattered. He gambled a little and rode a great deal and went up to town for months at a stretch, and when he was home he filled the house with a certain sort of company, bright and loud and expensive, and expected his wife to preside over it in silence and be grateful for the privilege. And Beatrice, given no love to spend, spent herself instead on the things she could reach. She learned the accounts of the trust that funded her because she did not trust the steward who kept them. She learned the tenants of Ashcombe, their names and their troubles and their small brave economies. She learned which cottages leaked and which children went hungry in the lean months, and she did quiet things about it, out of her own allowance, and asked for no credit. And in the evenings, when the loud company had gone or had not yet come, she took her mother's violin out of its worn case and played in the empty music room. And old Nan, her nurse from childhood, who had come with her to Ashcombe and stayed, would sit in the corner with her mending and listen, and say afterward, every time, that her mother was in the room when she played. It was the only thing anyone ever said to Beatrice that made her feel she still had a family. The steward was a man named Kroll, and Kroll was the kind of villain that these houses breed in their neglected corners, patient and grey and quietly greedy. He had kept the Ashcombe accounts for years, and Gerard trusted him without ever once looking at his figures. And Kroll had learned across those years that a duke who will not read his own ledgers is a duke who can be robbed at leisure by any man willing to keep 2 sets of books. Beatrice read the ledgers. She could not help it. Her mother had taught her that numbers, like music, do not lie unless a person forces them to. And she began to see, in the 2nd and 3rd years of her marriage, that someone was forcing them. Money left the trust that should have stayed. Leases were being quietly rewritten to raise the rents on families who had agreed to no increase. Repairs were being paid for that had never been made. She saw it all, and she said nothing, because she had learned the hard lesson of her girlhood that a woman who accuses without proof is called hysterical and dismissed, and a woman who is dismissed can help no one. So she began, quietly, to keep her own true book beside Kroll's false one, and to write down every discrepancy dated and initialed, and to wait. She was very good at waiting. She had been waiting, in one way or another, since she was 14. What hardened her patience into something colder happened one evening late in the 3rd year, when she came quietly down a back stair and heard voices in the library, Gerard's and Kroll's, low over the brandy, and she did the thing that changes a life, which is to stop on the stair and listen. Kroll was murmuring some caution about the accounts, some worry that a question might be asked, and Gerard's answer came lazy and certain through the door. Asked by whom? My wife? Beatrice would not know a false ledger from a hymn book. She is a dull, biddable creature who plays her fiddle and keeps her mouth shut, which is precisely why I married her. Leave the accounts to yourself and let her scrape away upstairs. She sees nothing and she wants nothing, and a man could not ask for a more convenient wife. Dull and biddable and sees nothing. Beatrice stood on the dark stair with her hand on the cold rail and did not move and did not breathe, and she did not fling open the door, because a door flung open ends a war before it starts. Instead, she took the words her husband had thrown away, dull and biddable and blind, and she carried them upstairs and laid them in the foundation of what she was building, because she had just learned the most useful thing a wronged woman can learn, which is that the men robbing her believed she could not see. Their contempt was a blindfold they had tied over their own eyes and called it hers. She would let them keep it on, right up until the morning she took it off for them. Lady Vivienne Marsh came into their lives the way a drought comes into a warm room, through a gap no one had thought to close. She was beautiful and clever and ambitious. A woman who had decided long ago that the surest road to consequence was through the vanity of powerful men. And in Gerard she found a road paved and waiting. Within a season she was at every gathering, laughing at his dull jokes as though they were witty, admiring his horses, flattering his taste, and Gerard, who had never been able to resist admiration, drank her in like a man dying of thirst. Beatrice watched it happen with the flat calm of a woman who has read this story before in her own house. She saw the change in Gerard's collars and the change in the accounts, for a mistress is expensive and the money came from somewhere, and the somewhere she knew was the trust and the tenants. But what Vivienne wanted was not only Gerard. Vivienne had heard, the way ambitious people hear everything, that the Duchess of Ashcombe owned a violin of great value and greater fame, the very instrument of the celebrated player whose name still meant something in musical circles, and Vivienne, who fancied herself musical and was in truth merely loud, had decided that she wanted it. Not to play, for she could barely play at all. To own, to be seen holding the famous violin, to have people whisper that the Duke thought so little of his dull wife and so much of his brilliant Lady Marsh that he had given her the Duchess's treasure. It would be a trophy, and a message, and a humiliation, all in one lovely object, and Vivienne wanted it the way she wanted everything, completely and without a moment's thought for whom it belonged to. She got Gerard to give it to her at a soir, in front of 30 people, and that was the cruelty of it, that it was done in public and done as a kindness. There was music that evening, and someone called for the famous violin, and Gerard, warm with wine and eager to shine in Vivienne's eyes, sent a footman up to the music room to fetch it. Beatrice was across the room when it was brought down, and she felt the blood leave her face, but she said nothing, because there were 30 people watching, and a scene would only make her the fool. And then Gerard, smiling, took her mother's violin from the footman's hands and turned, and instead of returning it to his wife, he presented it, with a little bow, to Lady Vivienne Marsh. "For you," he said, loud enough for the room. "A great instrument deserves a great artist, and I think we all know who that is." Vivienne took it, laughing, and tucked it under her chin and drew the bow across the strings in a screech that made a music lover wince, and the room applauded because the room always applauds a duke. And Beatrice stood very still by the wall and watched another woman's hands on the one thing her mother had left her, and understood that she was watching her own grief handed out like a party favour to the woman who had helped empty her marriage. And Vivienne, who never left a wound half-made when she could finish it, caught Beatrice's eye across the bright room as she lowered the bow, and she smiled, and she said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "I do hope you don't mind, Duchess. It seems such a waste, a thing like this, kept locked away by someone who so rarely performs. Some of us were made to be heard." A little laughter rippled through the guests, the light, cruel laughter of people who will laugh at anything a beautiful woman says, and Gerard laughed with them, his hand on the back of Vivienne's chair, and did not once look at his wife. Beatrice felt every eye in the room touch her and slide away, the way eyes slide off a woman who has just been made small, and she felt the old trained smile fix itself on her face like a mask nailed into place. She did not answer. There was no answer to be made in that room that would not have handed them more of her to laugh at. But something behind the mask went very quiet and very cold, the way a house goes quiet in the moment before a storm breaks over it, and she understood, standing there being smiled at, that the woman holding her mother's violin had just made the single greatest mistake of her charmed and grasping life. She had mistaken silence for surrender. They all had, every one of them. She did not cry. She did not cross the room. She smiled, faintly, the way she had trained herself to smile, and she waited until the evening was over and the guests had gone and the house was dark. And then she went to find her mother's violin. Vivienne had left it carelessly on a side table in the small salon, already bored of her trophy now that the audience had gone home. Beatrice picked it up in the dark and held it against her chest the way she had held it as a girl. And she carried it up to the music room and sat down on the cold floor with it across her knees, and for a long time she did nothing at all but breathe. She thought about her mother's hands. She thought about the market squares and the ordinary people who had loved that sound, and about a 14-year-old girl learning to draw a true note out of a difficult string, and about the one evening she had played for Gerard and been asked if she meant to be much longer. And she thought, with a clarity that felt like cold water, about what would happen if she simply took the violin back and hid it. Gerard would demand it returned to Vivienne, because his pride was now bound up in the gift. There would be a scene, and she would lose, because a wife loses, and the violin would go back under that woman's untrained chin to be screeched upon at parties until Vivienne tired of it and sold it to a stranger. Her mother's soul passed from careless hand to careless hand, a trophy, a joke. And Beatrice understood sitting on that cold floor in the hour before dawn, that there are some things a person must break with her own hands, precisely because breaking them is the only way left to keep them from being taken. Better her mother's violin should end here, in love, in her own grieving hands, than live on as another woman's plaything. She was not destroying it, she was refusing to let it be stolen. She thought, too, of the word Vivienne had used, waste, and of the laughter, and of the way not one person in that room had thought her worth defending, and she found, turning the violin in her cold hands, that she was not even angry at them any more. Because anger is a kind of hope, a belief that the other person might yet be made to understand, and she had stopped believing that Gerard or Vivienne would ever understand anything at all. What she felt instead was clarity, the terrible clean clarity of a woman who has finally set down the last of her hope and found her hands suddenly free. She lifted the violin once more to her chin, there in the empty music room in the dark, and she played her mother's piece one final time, softly all the way through, every note of it a private funeral that no one would ever hear, and when the last note had faded into the silence of the sleeping house, she lowered the bow, and she knew that she had said goodbye. And so, slowly, without anger, with something closer to a terrible tenderness, she closed her hands around the slender neck of the old instrument, and she snapped it clean through, and the deep-voiced old violin gave one last broken sound, and was silent. And Beatrice sat with the two pieces of it in her lap as the first grey light came into the room, and she did not weep, because she had passed all the way through weeping and come out the other side into something harder and clearer and far more dangerous. She thought, as the light grew, of her mother's words about violins and women, that a thing played with love grows warm and true, and a thing left in a case grows sullen and thin, and she understood at last the whole of what her mother had been trying to tell her. She had been left in a case for 6 years. She would not be left in one for a 7th. If they would not play her, she would take herself out of their hands entirely, and she would begin, that very morning, to become the warm and true and dangerous thing she had always had it in her to be. She had stopped enduring. By the time the sun was up, the Duchess of Ashcombe was a different woman, and her marriage, though her husband did not yet know it, was already over. Gerard's fury when he found the ruined violin was the fury of a vain man who has been embarrassed, which is the only kind of pain he was capable of feeling. He raged about the value of the thing, the scandal, what he would say to Lady Vivienne, and he demanded to know whether Beatrice had gone mad. And Beatrice looked at him, and she felt the last thread that had bound her to hope for this marriage go slack and fall away, and she said very quietly, "It was my mother's. It was mine. And you gave it away in front of 30 people to your mistress, as though my grief were yours to spend. You may keep everything else in this house, Gerard. You may keep the horses and the wine and Lady Marsh, but you will not keep one more thing that was my mother's, because there is nothing of hers left now for you to give away." He did not understand a word of it. He heard only defiance, and he stormed off to the club, and he told the story for weeks after as evidence of his wife's ingratitude and instability, and every time he told it, he made himself a little more the fool, though he never knew it. But Beatrice had meant every word, and more than she said. Because that morning, with the 2 halves of the violin wrapped in her mother's old shawl in the bottom of her wardrobe, she took out her true ledger. and she looked at all the patient entries she had made across 3 years, and she understood that the time for waiting was over. She would act now, once completely, and never need to act again. She began, as she always began, with the truth, assembled carefully, and made too heavy to lift. The fraud she had been quietly documenting was larger than she had first thought, and it was not Gerard's doing, or not only his. Kroll, the steward, had been bleeding the trust and the tenants for years, and Vivienne, it turned out, was not merely Gerard's mistress, but Kroll's partner, for the two of them had recognized in one another a fellow appetite, and had agreed to strip the estate between them while the Duke looked the other way at his horses. Gerard was not the mastermind. Gerard was the mark, a vain fool whose absence and inattention the two of them had cultivated like a crop. She had learned of the partnership almost by accident, and it was the discovery that turned a wife's private grief into a matter of law. Following one particular sum through the false ledger and out the other side, she had traced it to an account she did not recognize, and it had taken her the better part of a month, and the nervous bank clerk's quiet help to learn whose account it was, a joint holding, opened in secret in the names of Josiah Kroll and Vivienne Marsh. There it was, in black ink, the whole of it. The mistress and the steward were not two separate thieves who happened to feed on the same house. They were partners, deliberate and sworn, and they had between them made a plan of it: keep the Duke amused and blind, keep the Duchess dismissed and silent, and strip the estate to its bones before either of them thought to look up. Vivienne had wanted the violin not only as a trophy but as a test to see whether the dull wife would make a scene, and when Beatrice had only smiled and said nothing, the two of them had taken it as proof that she would never fight, and had grown bolder still. Their contempt had been their whole strategy, and their whole strategy had been a mistake. This complicated Beatrice's anger, though it did not soften her resolve. She found she could almost pity her husband, a man being robbed in his own house and too proud and too idle to see it, but pity is not the same as loyalty, and she owed him none. She needed allies, and she found them where she had spent years quietly earning them, among the overlooked. Old Nan produced a bundle of Beatrice's mother's letters, kept safe for years, and among them, astonishingly, a letter that established the true provenance and value of the violin and of the small musical fortune her mother had left, part of which had been quietly folded into the very trust that Kroll was now robbing, which meant his theft reached back further and dirtier than anyone knew. The nervous clerk at the county bank, whom Kroll had once bullied before a room full of his betters, began leaving Beatrice copies of the true transactions, and he did it for the same reason all of them did it. Because Beatrice had, without ever calculating it, spent years being the one person at Ashcombe worth being loyal to. She had defended the clerk's name once when it cost her nothing to stay silent, and he never forgot it. She had sat with old Nan through the winter the fever nearly took her, and Nan would have walked into fire for her. She had mended the tenants' roofs, and stood their children's indentures, and remembered their names and their troubles across years when no one else at the great house could be bothered to learn them, and now, when she needed them, they came to her one after another. Not because she commanded it, but because loyalty, unlike money, cannot be stolen, only earned, and she had been quietly earning it since the day she arrived. This was the thing Kroll and Vivienne, for all their cleverness, had never once thought to count. They had watched the money and forgotten the people, and it was the people who would undo them. Because a forged ledger can be explained away by a clever man, but a room full of honest tenants in their Sunday clothes cannot. And there was one more ally, one she had not expected and had not sought. His name was Elias Hart, and he was a maker and mender of instruments who kept a small workshop in the county town. A plain man in a leather apron with sawdust in his hair and the quietest hands Beatrice had ever seen. She went to him because she could not bear to leave the broken violin in the bottom of her wardrobe, and because some foolish part of her needed to know whether the thing could ever, even in some reduced way, be made whole. Elias took the two pieces from her without a word and turned them in the light with an expression of such genuine grief that Beatrice, who had not wept when she broke it, very nearly wept then at the sight of a stranger mourning her mother's violin as though he understood exactly what it was. "This was a great instrument," he said at last, softly, "made by a master, and played by one, I should think. You can hear it even in the silence of it. Who broke it?" And Beatrice, who had told no one the truth, found herself telling him, plainly, that she had broken it herself, and why. She expected him to be shocked. Instead, he was still for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly and said, "Then you did right. An instrument like this would rather be broken by someone who loved it than played by someone who did not. I can mend it. It will not be what it was, but it will play again, and it will be honest about what happened to it, which is more than most of us can say." And Beatrice looked at this plain man in his leather apron, who spoke of instruments as though they had souls, and of honesty as though it were the highest thing a person could offer, and she felt something she had not felt in years, which was the specific relief of being, for once, entirely understood. She came back to the workshop many times across the following weeks, more often than the mending strictly required, and she told herself each time that it was to check on the violin, and each time it was a little less true. Elias worked slowly, because good work is slow, steaming the broken wood, coaxing the two halves back toward one another, carving a new section for the neck from a piece of aged maple he had been saving, he said, for something that deserved it. He talked while he worked, not to feel the silence, but because he had things worth saying about grain and tension and the way an old instrument remembers every hand that has held it. And Beatrice, perched on a stool amid the sawdust and the smell of varnish, found herself talking too. More than she had talked to anyone in years. She told him about her mother and the market squares and the ordinary people who had wept to hear her play. She did not tell him she was a duchess, and he did not ask, and for those hours in the workshop she was simply a woman who knew about music, arguing with a man who knew about wood, and it was the happiest she had been since she was 14. Once he handed her a half-finished instrument, another commission, and asked her to play it so he could hear where it was still false, and she played, and he closed his eyes and listened with his whole body. And when she finished, he opened them and looked at her for a moment too long and said, quietly, "You play the way your mother must have." As though you mean it. No one had said such a thing to her in her whole married life. She left the workshop that evening with her heart doing something dangerous and unfamiliar, and she scolded herself the whole way home. Because there was a war to finish, and a woman in the middle of a war does not let herself want things she cannot yet have. Elias Hart was, as these stories will have it, more than he appeared, and Beatrice learned it slowly. In pieces, across the weeks she visited the workshop to watch the violin come back to life under his patient hands. He was the younger son of a baron, disinherited and glad of it, a man who had walked away from a title and an estate because he had wanted, more than he had wanted comfort or consequence, to spend his life making true things with his own hands. His family thought him a fool and a disgrace, and he thought himself the freest man in the county, and he was very nearly right. He told her the story of it one evening as the light went gold in the workshop windows, not as a confession, but as a plain account of a choice he had never once regretted. His father had offered him the whole of it, the estate and the name and a seat that had been in the family 400 years, on the single condition that he give up what his father called his tradesman's hobby. And Elias had looked at the offer and looked at his hands and chosen his hands. A title is a thing other people agree to call you, he said, turning a plane over in those quiet hands. It is only ever as real as their agreement. But a true note is a true note whether a king hears it or a beggar, and no one can vote it false. I would rather spend my life making things that are true on their own account than being called a thing that is only true because people bow. Beatrice, who had spent 6 years being called a duchess by people who did not see her at all, felt the words go into her like water into dry ground. She thought, here is a man who understands that what you are is not what you are called. Here is a man who chose to be earned rather than given. And she understood, watching him work, that she had married the opposite of this man, and that the difference between them was the whole difference between a life spent in a case and a life spent being played. He treated Beatrice from the first as a fellow artist rather than as a duchess, arguing with her about tone and tension and the character of old wood, and he had fallen half in love with her, though neither of them said so, long before he had any notion of her rank, and when he learned it, it changed nothing at all, because he had already chosen her for the only thing that had ever mattered to him, which was the quality of her attention and the truth of her grief. He was the perfect opposite of Gerard, who had married her for her fortune and could not be troubled to hear her play. But Beatrice did not let herself lean toward Elias yet, because she had learned to distrust her own hopes, and because there was still a reckoning to be finished, and a woman in the middle of a war does not stop to fall in love. She only knew that the workshop was the one place, besides the memory of her mother, where she felt like herself, and that the man in the leather apron looked at her as though she were worth listening to, and that these two facts were quietly rearranging something in her chest that she had thought permanently frozen. The reckoning, when it came the way she had planned it, in the open, before the people who mattered. Kroll and Vivienne, emboldened by Gerard's continuing blindness, had grown greedy and careless, and had at last reached too far, drawing up papers that would have stripped a dozen tenant families from land their grandfathers had cleared, and challenging, in a buried clause, the very trust that gave Beatrice her independence. Kroll laid the papers before her with a steward's smug certainty that the Duchess would sign what she was told, and in doing so he handed her the last document she needed, forged and dated and signed in his own careful hand. Now the case was whole. Beatrice went first to the Dowager, Gerard's formidable aunt, Lady Constance, keeper of the family's honour, who had never warmed to the merchant's granddaughter, but who cared, above all things, for the name of Ashcombe. Beatrice laid the 2 ledgers before her, the false and the true, and the letters and the forged papers, and said only that the choice before the family was whether its name would survive its steward or be dragged into the gutter with him. Lady Constance read for an hour in a terrible silence, turning the pages of the true ledger with a hand that grew slower and heavier as she went, and Beatrice watched the old woman's face move through disbelief and into something colder as the size of it came clear to her. The years of theft, the forged hands, the families threatened. All of it worked under the roof that bore her family's name, while her nephew rode his horses and gave away his wife's treasures. At the end of it she closed the true ledger very gently, as though it was something that might break, and she looked at Beatrice with an expression that was almost fear and almost admiration, and for a long moment she did not speak at all. Then she said, "I came into this room prepared to dislike you, as I have disliked you for 6 years, because I thought my nephew had married beneath the name. I find I was exactly wrong. He married above it, and had not the wit to know it." She rose slowly and drew herself up to her full formidable height. "I have spent my whole life guarding the honour of this family. I will not now let a steward and a fortune hunter drag it into the assizes while the one honest person under this roof stands alone. I have misjudged you badly, girl, and I find I am glad of it. My nephew is a fool, and you are not, and I will stand with the one of you who is not. And God help anyone who stands against us." With the dowager's weight behind her, the case could not be smothered, and both women knew it, and something passed between them in that dim room that neither had expected to feel, which was the beginning of a respect that would, in the years to come, warm slowly into something very like love. It was heard before the magistrates and, more importantly, before the assembled county, in the same kind of bright crowded room where Gerard had given away the violin, and Beatrice stood before them all in a plain dark gown, and laid out the truth, one clean stone at a time. She read the forged leases beside the true ones. She traced the stolen money from the trust into Kroll's accounts, and from Kroll's into an account held jointly, damningly, with Lady Vivienne Marsh. She produced the bank clerk, and old Nan and her mother's letters, and the tenants themselves, the leaking cottage families and the hungry winter families, who stood in their Sunday clothes and told in plain words what had been done to them, and who had quietly stood between them and ruin for years. And then, at the last, Beatrice did something no one expected. She had brought the violin, mended now by Elias's patient hands, scarred but whole, honest about what had happened to it, and she held it up before the room and told them, without a tremor, the story of the soir, of a grieving woman's last treasure handed to a mistress as a party favour, and she said, "You applauded that night, because a duke smiled, and you always applaud a duke. I ask you only to remember, now that you know the rest, what it is you were applauding." Then she tucked her mother's mended violin beneath her chin, and in that silent, crowded, breathless room she played. She played the piece her mother had loved best, the one she had once played for a husband who yawned, and the sound that came out of the scarred old instrument was not perfect, because it had been broken, but it was true, and truth in a room that has just heard the truth is a devastating thing. When she lowered the bow, no one applauded, because applause was too small. They simply sat, and they understood, all of them, exactly what kind of woman had been living dull and silent in the great house at Ashcombe, and exactly what kind of men had failed to see her. It was Vivienne who broke first, and she broke the way the guilty always break by reaching for the weapon that had worked before. She rose, pale beneath her powder, and said in a high, tight voice that this was a great deal of theatre, a wronged wife's performance, and that a woman scraping at a fiddle proved nothing about accounts. But the room had changed, and she had not felt it change, and her words fell into a silence that was no longer on her side. A voice from among the tenants, old Barden the farmer, said plainly, without rising, "It's not the fiddle that proves it, my lady. It's the 6 years of rent you took off families that never agreed to pay it. The fiddle just tells us who we're dealing with." And the room murmured its agreement, low and dangerous, and Vivienne looked around at the faces and saw at last that the wind had turned, and she sat down, and she said nothing more. Because there was nothing left to say that would not make it worse. Kroll did not even try. He had gone grey to the lips, watching his own forged papers read aloud in his own careful hand, and when the magistrate turned to him he only shook his head, once like a man watching a house he built come down on top of him. Justice fell by the exact degree of each person's guilt. Kroll, who had done the forging and the stealing with his own grey hands, was prosecuted and convicted on evidence so complete that his counsel scarcely rose, and he was stripped of everything and transported beyond the sea, to a place where no one would ever trust him with a ledger again. Vivienne Marsh, who had wanted the violin as a trophy and the estate as a purse, received the punishment her own nature had always guaranteed her. The money stopped, and with it stopped every friend she had, and she found that a woman who values people only for their use has no one at all when her use for them ends. She left the county in debt and disgrace, and drifted to some other town to begin the same work on some other fool, and grew, by every account, thin and hard and friendless, undone not by Beatrice's hand but by the pitiless arithmetic of her own cold heart. And Gerard, the vain fool who had been robbed in his own house, was publicly humbled, exposed before the whole county not as a villain, but as something in its way more contemptible, a man too idle and too proud to guard his own people, a man who had given away his wife's treasure to the very woman helping to ruin him. To his small credit, at the very end, he did the one honest thing left in his power. He stood in that room, and he said aloud that his wife had been worth 10 of him, that he had been blind and vain and small, and that he asked nothing of her because he had earned nothing. It was the truest sentence he had ever spoken, and it came far too late to buy him anything at all. There was one more moment between them, months later, that Beatrice would remember not with triumph, but with a kind of weary peace. Gerard found her alone in the music-room, the mended violin in her hands, and he stood a while in the doorway the way he never had in all their marriage, and at last he said, quietly, that he had been thinking about the night he gave the violin away, and that he understood now what he had done, and that of everything he had lost, it was the sound of her playing that he missed most, the sound he had yawned through, and never once truly heard. He asked humbly whether she would play for him only once. And Beatrice looked at him, this man who had kept her in a case for 6 years and only wanted to hear her now that she belonged to no one, and she felt no anger and no cruelty, only the plain flat truth, and she said gently, "No, Gerard, not because I wish to punish you, because that music was never yours to ask for. You had 6 years to hear it, and you chose your club. I play now for people who listen, and you were never one of them." And she turned back to the window and after a while she heard him go. It was the last time he asked her for anything. Forgiveness, she had learned, is not the same as return, and a woman may pity a man and wish him no harm and still never again lift the bow for him. Because some doors, once a person has yawned their way out of them, do not open a second time. The marriage was dissolved, quietly and lawfully, with the dowager's help and the county's blessing, and no one blamed Beatrice, because the county had watched her save it. Gerard lived out his reduced years at Ashcombe as a guest in the life he had squandered, watching from a distance as the woman he had overlooked became, without him, everything she had always been underneath. She did not remarry in haste, and for a long while she did not think of remarrying at all, because she had discovered in the quiet after the reckoning that she was for the first time in her life entirely her own. Mistress of the restored trust, guardian of the tenants, sovereign of a life she had built with her own patient hands. And there is a particular joy in that sovereignty that a woman who has only ever been someone's wife can scarcely imagine until she holds it. She set the estate to rights the way she did everything, patiently and without noise. The rents were returned to what had been fairly agreed, and the families Kroll had threatened kept their land, and the cottages that leaked were mended before the winter, and the children who had gone hungry in the lean months did not go hungry again. She took, with the dowager's blessing, the management of the whole trust into her own hands, and under those hands it did what it had never done under Kroll's, which was to prosper honestly, so that there was more for everyone and less taken by anyone. And she did a thing that surprised the county and delighted it. She used a part of the restored income to found a small music school in the county town, where the children of tenants and tradesmen could learn what only the rich had been allowed to learn before, and she taught there herself, one afternoon a week, a duchess in a plain gown, showing a farmer's daughter how to draw a true note from a borrowed instrument. She said, when the dowager asked her why, that her mother had played for ordinary people in market squares, and that it seemed the right way to spend what her mother had left her on ordinary people learning to make something true. The school outlasted them all. There are grown musicians in that county still who first held a bow because a broken-hearted duchess decided, one cold dawn, that she had endured enough. She played again, often, in the music room that was now truly hers, on the scarred and mended violin, and old Nan sat in the corner with her mending and said every time that her mother was in the room. And Elias Hart came, sometimes up from the town, and they would play together in the evenings, the violin and his low, quiet voice, and argue about tone and old wood, and slowly, with no hurry at all, because neither of them had anything left to prove or to fear. The thing that had been rearranging itself in Beatrice's chest settled at last into place, and she understood that she had found, in a man with sawdust in his hair, the one person who had loved her mother's violin as much as she did, and who loved the woman who played it more. Their courtship, if you could call so unhurried a thing a courtship, was carried on almost entirely in the workshop and the music room, over old wood and true notes, and it grew the way the best things grow, so slowly that neither could later say when it had begun. Elias never once asked her to be anything other than what she was. He did not want a duchess, and he did not want to be made a duke, and when she offered, half in jest, to make him master of the estate, he laughed and said he would rather keep his workshop and his leather apron and come up to the great house of an evening to play. because a man should hold on to the things that are true on their own account. And Beatrice loved him the more for refusing what every other man in England would have seized with both hands. They married in the end, quietly, in the small church at the edge of the Asham land, in plain clothes among the tenants and the workshop apprentices, and old Nan weeping in the front pew, and the dowager Lady Constance sitting very straight, with an expression that on a softer woman would have been called joy. The music school's first pupils played them out of the church, badly and joyfully, on borrowed instruments, and it was, everyone agreed, the least fashionable and the happiest wedding the county had seen in a generation, warm, for exactly the reason it was plain. That every soul in the church had chosen to be there out of love and gratitude, and nothing else. But that is almost beside the point, because Beatrice had already won everything that mattered before she ever married Elias, and would have been whole without him, and both of them knew it, and that was exactly why it worked. She married him not out of need, but out of the plain glad wanting of him, which is the only good reason anyone ever has, and the only kind of marriage that never grows cold. Years later, in a warm house full of music and children, the mended violin hung in a place of honour, and sometimes a daughter would ask about the pale scar across its neck where the wood had once been broken and joined again, and Beatrice would take it down and turn it in the light and tell the truth, which was that she had broken it herself one cold morning long ago, rather than let it be stolen. And when the child asked why anyone would break a thing they loved, Beatrice would say that there are some things you break so that they can never be taken, and that the breaking is not the end of them, if you love them enough to mend them after, and that the scar is not a shame but a history, proof that the thing survived the worst that was done to it, and still, in the end, made music. She would let the child run a small finger along the pale line in the wood, and she would say that a person is much the same as a violin, that we are all of us, in the end, the sum of how we have been treated and what we have chosen to do about it, and that a life without a single scar in it has usually not been truly played. Then she would tuck the old instrument beneath her chin and draw the bow across the strings, and out of the mended wood would come her mother's peace, deep and dark and true, filling the warm house the way it had once filled a market square, and every child in the room would go still to hear it. Because there is nothing in the world quite like the sound of a broken thing that was loved enough to be made whole and taught at last to sing again. And Beatrice would tell them too, the other half of it, the half that mattered more, which was that breaking the violin had not been the end of the story but the beginning. Because a week after she snapped it, she had carried it to a man who knew how to mend, and the mending had brought her a life. She would say that the snapping was necessary and the mending was grace, and that a person needs both, the courage to break what must not be stolen and the faith to believe it can be made to sing again, and that most people manage only one and spend their lives either hoarding things too frightened to protect them or breaking things too bitter to repair them. She had done both. That was the whole secret of her, if she had a secret. She had loved the violin enough to break it, and loved it enough to mend it, and in between those two acts she had become, at last, a woman no one could keep in a case again. She had been a woman the world thought too dull and too meek to do anything at all, married to a man who gave away her grief as a party favour, and she had answered him not with tears and not with screaming, but with one clean, quiet, irreversible act in the hour before dawn. And everything true in her life had grown from that broken string. Her worth had never been in being chosen, or in being kept, or in keeping silent. It had been in knowing at last exactly what was hers, and exactly what she would never let another hand take. So tell me in the comments whether you think she was right to break it, and where in the world you are watching from tonight, and if this story moved you even a little, then subscribe and stay close, because there is always another cold house and another overlooked woman inside it, and always, always a moment in the dark when she finally decides that she has endured enough.